At 3:47 in the morning, on November 22, 1905, in a room lined with velvet and secrets, the heir to America's greatest retail empire stopped breathing, surrounded by strangers who could never speak his name. The snow had begun falling over Chicago 3 hours earlier, the kind of heavy, silent snow that muffles the city's perpetual industrial roar and transforms even the filthiest streets into something resembling purity. By dawn, a pristine white blanket would cover the evidence of 1,000 daily transactions, the soot and horse manure and discarded newspapers, all temporarily erased beneath nature's indifferent forgiveness. It was the sort of morning when respectable citizens remained behind locked doors, when the distance between warmth and death could be measured in mere blocks, when only those with urgent business or shameful secrets ventured into the frozen darkness. Marshall Field II had ventured out with both. Inside Room 7 of the Everleigh Club, the most expensive brothel in the United States, a man lay dying on sheets that cost more than most Chicago workers earned in a month. The room itself was a masterpiece of calculated opulence, burgundy velvet curtains imported from Lyon, Persian carpets thick enough to silence footsteps, crystal decanters catching the gaslight and throwing fractured rainbows across walls papered in silk damask. Heavy drapes held back the November cold, shutting out the thin Chicago dawn while oil lamps burned low, their light soft and golden, falling over carved wood and gilt-framed mirrors. Everything in the Everleigh Club whispered of money, but money deployed with a purpose entirely opposite to the respectable world 3 miles north. Here, wealth purchased not virtue, but its exquisite opposite. Marshall Field II, 37 years old, heir to a fortune estimated at $100 million, lay rigid on the bed where pleasure was expected and discretion guaranteed. His white dress shirt, tailored on Savile Row and monogrammed with his initials in thread finer than most men's Sunday clothes, was torn open, the immaculate fabric ruined by a spreading bloom of dark crimson. The bullet had entered 2 inches below his navel, angled sharply upward, tearing through intestines and abdominal cavity with the sort of trajectory that made the official story impossible before it was even conceived. A physician knelt at his side, sleeves rolled back, hands unsteady with more than professional concern. This was not his usual theater of work. He was accustomed to respectable parlors, to sanitized emergencies framed by proper curtains and ancestral portraits, not this clandestine sanctuary where perfume and cigarette smoke clung to the velvet walls. His fingers pressed down hard on the wound, but the blood slid between them, warm and insistent, each towel becoming a sodden, useless relic in a room where everything that once felt decadent now felt like evidence. The physician knew exactly who lay beneath his hands. Chicago knew the name Marshall Field, the way Rome once knew Caesar, the way Florence once knew Medici. It was less a name than a dynasty, a guarantee of order and money and respectability. It did not belong in this room. It had no place amid silk bodices thrown over chairs and crystal stemware abandoned on side tables. Behind the physician, in the dim border between the bed and the doorway, 2 women stood very still. Minna and Ada Everleigh, elegant proprietors whose faces revealed nothing, had built their empire on discretion, on understanding that their wealthiest patrons purchased silence as much as pleasure. They charged $50 merely for entry, equivalent to $1,800 today, and that astronomical sum bought not just champagne and beautiful women, but absolute confidentiality. Yet here was a crisis that money alone could not resolve. Field remained conscious, barely. His eyes, a pale, almost washed-out blue, flickered from the physician's face to the ceiling overhead. He tried to speak, his mouth parting, lips dry. What emerged was not a confession, not an explanation, but a ragged, half-formed sound, more breath than language, more regret than intention. When he finally managed words, they carried the weight of a man who understood that his final cooperation was essential to the emerging fiction. It was an accident, he whispered through gritted teeth. At home. Cleaning begun. The calculation was instantaneous and ruthless. 3 people in that room knew the complete truth. The physician, bound by professional ethics, but vulnerable to financial persuasion. The Everleigh sisters themselves, whose business depended on protecting secrets. And Marshall Field II, who would be dead by afternoon, and whose final words would become the cornerstone of a lie. Across town, Marshall Field and Company stood like a cathedral to American commerce, its 9 stories of marble and mahogany rising above State Street with architectural confidence that seemed to mock the very concept of failure. The great store's windows blazed with electric light, a recent innovation that cost a fortune to maintain but signaled modernity and permanence. Inside those walls, beneath the famous Tiffany mosaic dome, the machinery of retail empire hummed even in the pre-dawn darkness. The store operated on a philosophy its founder had made famous: give the lady what she wants. It was a temple to customer satisfaction, to the idea that sufficient wealth and attention to detail could create not just a business, but a civic institution. Women traveled from across the Midwest to shop beneath that Tiffany dome, to walk those marble floors, to be treated not as mere customers, but as valued patrons of something approaching art. Yet at this precise moment, while that cathedral of commerce stood gleaming and respectable in the November snow, its future owner was bleeding out in a room where ladies were available for entirely different transactions, where what they wanted cost $50 at the door and whatever a man's conscience could bear thereafter. The irony was savage and perfect. Marshall Field III had spent decades constructing an empire of respectability, a fortress of virtue built on attention to propriety and obsessive concern with public reputation. He had made his fortune selling the accoutrements of respectable life, the dresses and gloves and household furnishings that allowed Chicago's rising middle class to perform their own versions of gentility. His store was more than a business. It was a statement about what America could become, about how commerce and culture could merge into something approaching civilization. And his only son, his heir, the man who would inherit this empire of virtue, had just been shot in the most notorious brothel in the United States. By dawn, the official story was already crystallizing with the efficiency that had built the Field commercial empire. Marshall Field II had been at home, in his private study at the family mansion on Prairie Avenue. He had been cleaning a firearm, a plausible activity for a gentleman who occasionally hunted. The gun had discharged accidentally. A tragic domestic mishap, the sort of thing that could happen to anyone, though it happened most frequently to those careless with weapons or distracted by melancholy. The story was perfect because it was barely believable, and barely believable was sufficient when the family in question controlled more advertising revenue than any newspaper in Chicago could afford to lose. Someone in the room spoke, voice low and urgent. The words were not recorded, but the intention was timeless. This never happened here. Carriages were summoned. Money began to flow to strategic recipients. The machinery of the Field empire was already grinding into motion, the fixers being summoned, the narrative being rewritten in real time. As Marshall's breathing shallowed, the carriage waited, the doctor calculated, and the madams measured their options against their survival. They all understood what this moment would cost them if it was mishandled. A dynasty was at stake, a reputation, a fortune larger than most nations' treasuries. The heir to America's greatest store had everything a man could want, yet in the decisive moment, he had escaped it all, into the only place in Chicago where the man could exist without the dynasty, where a first name could be whispered without its last, where the gilded reputation of respectable. Men went to breathe unrespectable air. 3 people knew the truth. 2 would be paid extraordinary sums to forget. The 3rd was already dying and would take his final secret to a grave marked with lies. To understand why the heir to a $100 million fortune died in a brothel while his family spent decades pretending it happened at home, we must journey back to the merchant prince who built the palace, and the fragile son who could never escape its gilded walls. To comprehend the son's fall, one must first understand the father's empire, built not with steel and stone, but with iron will and suffocating expectations. Marshall Field I arrived in Chicago in 1856 with precisely nothing except an unshakable conviction that fortune favored those willing to work longer, think sharper, and endure more than their competitors. He was 21 years old, a farm boy from Conway, Massachusetts, where his father had scratched out a subsistence, living from rocky New England soil. Chicago in those days was less a city than a wager against nature, a collection of wooden structures rising from swampland with the sort of reckless optimism that characterized the entire American experiment. It stank of slaughterhouses and ambition, of horse manure and possibility. The streets turned to impassable mud with each rain, yet fortunes were being carved from that mud by men who understood that civilization was not inherited, but constructed through sheer force of will. Marshall Field understood this perfectly. He began as a clerk in a dry goods store, a position so humble that most men of education would have considered it beneath notice. But Field noticed everything. He observed how wealthy women shopped, what they desired beyond the mere transaction of currency for cloth. He understood that commerce was theater, that retail was not simply about selling products, but about creating an experience that made customers feel elevated by their purchases. While other merchants treated shoppers as necessary annoyances, Field treated them as patrons of an emerging art form. His philosophy crystallized into a single phrase that would echo through retail history: "Give the lady what she wants." It sounded accommodating, even gentle, but beneath it lay a ruthless commercial logic. If you could anticipate desire before it fully formed, you did not merely serve the market, you governed it. Years of quiet observation hardened into doctrine, and when Field eventually attached his name to a store of his own, he crafted not merely a business, but a cathedral to American capitalism. Then came 1871, and the Great Chicago Fire reduced his empire to ash in a single October night. Most men would have accepted ruin. Marshall Field rebuilt. Within months, his store rose again, larger and more magnificent than before. The disaster that destroyed Chicago became the foundation for Field's legend. While others fled or despaired, he doubled his investment in the city's future, understanding that from great destruction comes greater opportunity. By 1893, his new 9-story building on State Street stood as the largest and most luxurious retail establishment in the United States. It was not merely a store, but a secular temple where commerce and culture merged into something that transcended mere buying and selling. The building's Tiffany mosaic dome scattered colored light across marble floors imported from Italy. Mahogany fixtures gleamed under electric lights, a modern miracle that cost more to operate in a single month than most businesses earned in a year. The famous Great Clock at the corner of State and Washington became Chicago's most recognizable landmark, a symbol of punctuality and permanence in a city that had burned to the ground a generation earlier. Marshall Field I presided over this domain with the stern, unyielding authority of an Old Testament patriarch. By 1905, his fortune exceeded $120 million, equivalent to nearly $4 billion in contemporary currency. He was not simply wealthy. He had transcended wealth into something approaching civic institution. Chicago existed in its modern form partly because Marshall Field had willed it into existence. But Marshall Field I did not give his son what he wanted: freedom. Marshall Field II was born in 1868 into a destiny he had not chosen and could never escape. From his first breath, he was not simply a child, but an investment, the biological continuation of a commercial dynasty that demanded perpetuation. The tragedy, visible almost immediately to everyone except the father, was that the son was constructed of entirely different material. Where Marshall Field I was granite, Marshall Field II was porcelain. The father possessed an almost predatory awareness of every transaction, every customer, every shifting trend in the market. The son seemed perpetually elsewhere, his attention drifting towards some interior landscape that had nothing to do with profit margins or inventory management. Young Marshall possessed sensibilities entirely unsuited to his inherited role. He collected rare books with the passion his father reserved for quarterly earnings reports. He could quote Keats and Shelley, but struggled through balance sheets. He attended the opera not as social performance, but because music moved him in ways that commerce never could. He was, in the parlance of his era, artistic, a word his father pronounced with the same distaste he might reserve for bankrupt or incompetent. The father saw weakness where sensitivity dwelled. The son felt suffocation where others saw privilege. When Marshall II was installed in the family business at the age of 18, it was a coronation of reluctance. He was given titles and offices, surrounded by executives who deferred to his name while ignoring his input. He moved through the store like a ghost, a pale figure in immaculate tailoring who seemed to shrink as he walked beneath the Tiffany dome. To secure the dynasty, the father orchestrated the final phase of the Heirs' entrapment: marriage. In 1890, Marshall Field II wed Albertine Huck, a society beauty from a prominent brewing family. On paper, it was the perfect merger of Chicago fortunes, a union that solidified the Field's social standing. The wedding was the event of the season, a spectacle of lace and flowers and public rejoicing that society pages praised as the union of two illustrious names. But behind the closed doors of their Prairie Avenue mansion, the union was a cold treaty. Albertine was a woman of spirit and ambition who found herself married to a man who was disappearing inside himself. They produced 3 children: Marshall III in 1893, Henry in 1894, and Gwendolyn in 1898, fulfilling the biological imperative of the dynasty. The bloodline was secure. The photographs were taken. The Christmas cards were sent. Yet by 1905, the marriage had become a hollow performance of respectability masking private desolation. They maintained separate bedrooms in the massive mansion, appearing together only at necessary social functions where they performed the choreography of marital unity with the practiced precision of professional actors. The children grew up in a household where affection was rationed like a scarce commodity, where their father was a distant figure who moved through their lives with the distracted air of a man perpetually elsewhere. Marshall Field II walked those halls like a prisoner in a gilded cell, surrounded by every material comfort yet suffocating under the weight of expectations he could neither fulfill nor escape. The Field standard of perfection demanded that he show no weakness, be the perfect gentleman at the club, the perfect executive at the store, the perfect host at the dinner party. He had to wear the mask of the merchant prince while his soul was screaming for release. The heir to America's most virtuous fortune had everything a man could want, except the one thing wealth cannot purchase: the right to choose his own destiny. The cracks in the porcelain began to show early hairline fractures that would eventually shatter an entire dynasty. By the final years of the 19th century, Marshall Field II had perfected the most exhausting performance of his life, appearing impeccably successful while slowly suffocating in plain sight. The mansion on Prairie Avenue stood as both palace and prison, a towering monument of dark mahogany and imported marble that occupied an entire block of Chicago's most exclusive address. Millionaires' Row, they called it, where the Pullmans and the Armours and the Fields constructed palaces that announced their dominance over the commercial landscape. Yet within those cavernous walls, amid oil paintings of stern ancestors and heavy velvet curtains that absorbed light rather than reflected it, Marshall Field II was slowly disappearing. Victorian physicians had diagnosed his condition with fashionable precision: neurasthenia. It was the malady of the age, a catch-all term popularized by neurologist George Miller Beard to describe what he termed the nervous exhaustion of modern civilization. The diagnosis encompassed what we might now recognize as clinical depression, anxiety disorders, and the particular psychological torment of sensitive souls trapped in rigid expectations they could neither meet nor escape. For men of Marshall's class, neurasthenia offered a veneer of medical legitimacy to spiritual despair, transforming an existential crisis into a treatable condition of overworked nerves. But there was nothing respectable about the reality. Marshall woke each morning in his separate bedroom, staring at ceilings painted with cherubs and clouds, feeling the weight of the coming day settle over him like a burial shroud. The routine never varied, each element another component of the armor he wore into the world. His valet would arrive with clothing already selected, the starched collar that felt like a noose, the silk cravat, the waistcoat cut by tailors who charged more for a single garment than most Chicago families earned in 6 months. Each piece was carefully chosen to maintain what everyone called the field standard, that unspoken but absolute requirement of perfection that hung over him like a threat. The medicine bottles accumulated on his bedside table like a private apothecary of despair. Brown glass containers with elaborate labels promising relief from nervous exhaustion, from melancholy, from the unnamed dread that seemed to thicken the air in his lungs. Laudanum for sleep that would not come naturally. Bromides for anxiety that never truly subsided. Cocaine-laced tonics that physicians prescribed with confident authority, promising they would restore vigor and masculine energy. He consumed them dutifully, following the rituals of treatment, as he followed every other prescribed ritual of his existence, yet the relief they offered was temporary and increasingly inadequate. While his father conquered new markets with the relentless efficiency that had made the field name synonymous with commercial dominance, Marshall II struggled to conquer his own interior darkness. The pressure to maintain the field standard was eroding whatever remained of his sanity. This standard was never explicitly articulated, but was understood by everyone who bore the name. Perfection in public, absolute discretion in private, no scandal, no weakness, no hint that the dynasty was anything less than invulnerable. Every public appearance was scrutinized by society pages. Every business decision was measured against his father's legendary acumen. Every social interaction carried the weight of the family reputation. He attended the required functions, sitting in boardrooms where men discussed profit margins and expansion strategies in tones of aggressive certainty. He signed documents placed before him by executives who had learned to route important decisions around him, preserving the fiction of his authority while ensuring he could do no actual damage. At charity galas where Chicago's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their benevolence, he stood beside Albertine in their coordinated performance of Marital Unity, two actors who had long since forgotten their lines but continued the show through muscle memory. The imposter syndrome was absolute. In those mahogany-paneled rooms, surrounded by men who had clawed their way up from nothing, Marshall sat like a well-dressed ornament. He was the nominal superior to men who, in any meritocratic system, would have been his masters. Without his surname, he knew he would be nothing more than a sensitive, anxious man with a taste for poetry, likely working a clerk's desk in the very store he was destined to own. His marriage to Albertine had devolved into a polite, icy estrangement that mirrored the cold architecture of their shared prison. Albertine, a woman of considerable social grace and resilience, had eventually tired of trying to animate a husband who was perpetually retreating into himself. By 1905, they had reached the tacit agreement common among the unhappy elite. They would perform the pageant of marriage for the benefit of the public and live entirely separate emotional lives in private. They shared a roof, a name, and 3 children, but they did not share a life. The children, Marshall III, Henry, and Gwendolyn, grew up viewing their father as a distant, tragic figure. He was a man who moved through the nursery with a tentative, almost apologetic air, as if he were intruding on their childhood. He loved them, perhaps, in the abstract way that duty required, but his capacity to express that love was strangled by his own internal paralysis. They saw him mostly in transit, a figure in a tuxedo heading out to a gala he dreaded, or a silhouette in a study window, staring out at the rain with a glass of whiskey in his hand. As the neurasthenia deepened, the coping mechanisms became more dangerous. Alcohol became less of a social lubricant and more of an anesthetic, dulling the sharp edges of his anxiety and blurring the reality of his inadequacy into something tolerable. The servants began to notice the empty decanters, the slightly slurred speech in the early evenings, the way his hands shook until the first drink settled them. Friends at the club whispered about his nerves, speaking in the coded language that gentlemen used to discuss the unraveling of one of their own. The silences grew longer, his responses to direct questions delayed and vague. Then came the mysterious disappearances. He would leave the mansion in the evening, telling no one his destination, and return in the early morning hours with his clothing disheveled, and his eyes carrying the haunted look of a man who had been somewhere he could not discuss. He was seeking something that his sanitized, velvet-lined life could not provide, the feeling of being real, even if that reality was sordid. He needed to escape not from Chicago, but from himself, from the relentless interior voice that catalogued his inadequacies, from the mirror that showed him a pale imitation of his father's granite certainty. The facade of the perfect heir was crumbling. He was a man walking on a frozen lake that was beginning to groan beneath his weight, the neurasthenia evolving into something darker, a desperate, clawing need for oblivion. He was tired of the expectations, tired of the judgment, tired of the crushing weight of being the son of a great man. He began to live a double life, not out of malice, but out of necessity. In the daylight, he was the dutiful son, the respectable husband, the board member. But as the sun set and the gas lamps flickered to life across Chicago, a different man emerged, a man driven by hunger to be unburdened. He believed he could keep these two worlds separate, that his fortune protected him, that the walls of the Field dynasty were thick enough to keep the consequences of his nocturnal wanderings at bay. It was the fatal arrogance of the protected class, the belief that the rules of cause and effect were for other, poorer people. But the cracks were widening. The porcelain was ready to shatter. The tension between the man he was supposed to be and the man he actually was had become unbearable. In 1905 Chicago, if a wealthy man wanted to disappear from the weight of his own name, there was one district that specialized in making the powerful anonymous, for a price. Just 3 miles south of the Field Fortress lay a world that operated by entirely different laws, where wealth bought not respectability, but its exquisite opposite. The Levee District sprawled along the south side like an open wound in Chicago's moral fabric, a 20-block expanse of calculated vice that the city's power brokers simultaneously condemned in Sunday sermons and patronized in midnight carriages. It was Chicago's pressure valve, a necessary evil that allowed the city's ironclad respectability to maintain its facade by providing a quarantine zone for its darkest appetites. Aldermen collected their tribute from its profits. Police captains walked its streets not to enforce morality, but to regulate it. Newspaper editors wrote periodic editorials demanding reform, while their publishers arrived through back entrances after the gas lamps were lit. At the epicenter of this gilded underworld, reigning like a jeweled parasite on the body of Chicago, stood the Everleigh Club at 2133 South Dearborn Street. An establishment so luxurious it transcended the vulgar category of brothel and approached something closer to a secular temple of hedonistic philosophy. To call it merely a house of prostitution was to insult both its ambition and its extraordinary clientele. Minna and Ada Everleigh, sisters by choice if not by birth, had not journeyed to Chicago to operate a common bordello. They had conceived something far more sophisticated, a fantasy palace where men of power and pedigree could shed the suffocating armor of their public lives in surroundings so exquisite that even shame felt luxurious. The sisters understood, with the precision of psychologists, that what Chicago's elite feared most was not sin itself, but exposure. So they created a hermetically sealed universe where transgression could be indulged in absolute safety, where discretion was more valuable than gold. Entry to the Everleigh Club cost $50, equivalent to $1,800 in contemporary currency, and that astronomical sum purchased merely admission, not services. It was both a financial barrier and a psychological threshold, ensuring that only Chicago's most prosperous and most discreet would cross into this parallel dimension. The fee served a dual function. It financed a level of opulence that stunned even the jaded wealthy, and it guaranteed that everyone present possessed too much to lose to risk betraying the sanctuary's secrets. Inside, the club was a sensory overload of calculated luxury that made the field mansion seem austere by comparison. 50 rooms had been designed as individual dreams made manifest. The gold room with its $15,000 piano, its keys inlaid with mother of pearl, and its case gilded with genuine gold leaf. The silver room where everything gleamed like captured moonlight. The Moorish room with its Arabian Nights fantasy of silk cushions and incense. The Japanese room with its delicate screens and lacquered surfaces. Fountains in the main parlor sprayed perfume instead of water, filling the air with mists of violet and jasmine that masked the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. Crystal chandeliers imported from Austria scattered prismatic light across walls covered in silk damask from Lyon. Turkish carpets so thick they silenced footsteps covered floors of inlaid mahogany. Every surface gleamed. Every corner held some new marvel of expensive taste deployed without restraint or conscience. The Everleigh sisters themselves presided over this domain with the sophisticated authority of women who understood their business with perfect clarity. Minna handled the finances with an acumen that would have impressed Marshall Field of Fath himself, maintaining ledgers that tracked not just revenue, but the psychological profiles of their most valuable patrons. Ada managed the atmosphere and the women, ensuring that every detail contributed to the carefully constructed fantasy of respectable debauchery. They dressed in Paris gowns, spoke multiple languages, and could discuss literature, opera, and politics with the same ease they applied to managing the complex logistics of their establishment. The women they employed, whom they called their butterflies, were selected with standards more rigorous than most universities applied to faculty appointments. Beauty was merely the baseline requirement. The Everleigh girls were educated, multilingual, trained in conversation and deportment with the precision of finishing school graduates. They could quote Shakespeare, discuss the latest novels, debate political developments, and provide the intoxicating illusion of genuine interest in whatever topic a patron wished to explore. Many came from respectable but impoverished backgrounds, drawn by wages that exceeded what a factory supervisor might earn in an entire year. They were actresses performing the most lucrative role available to women in an era that offered few alternatives to marriage or servitude. Marshall Field II became a regular patron sometime in the winter of 1904, though the exact date of his initiation into this gilded underworld remains obscured by the same discretion that protected all of the club's guests. He was drawn not merely by the promise of physical pleasure, which his wealth could have purchased in 1,000 less elaborate venues, but by the intoxicating possibility of anonymity. Within those perfumed walls, surrounded by champagne and silk and women who addressed him by his first name without the burden of his Roman numeral, he could temporarily shed the crushing identity of the field heir. Here, in the mirror-lined salons where crystal decanters caught the gaslight and threw fractured rainbows across silk-papered walls, Marshall was not the disappointing son of a commercial titan. He was not the neurasthenic husband trapped in a loveless marriage performed for society's benefit. He was not the inadequate executive signing documents he barely comprehended, while more capable men made the actual decisions. He was simply a patron whose money was good, whose secrets were safe, and whose desires were treated with the utmost seriousness by women trained to make every man feel like the most fascinating creature civilization had ever produced. The sanctuary was intoxicating precisely because it was the opposite of everything his daylight life represented. Where the Field Mansion was cold marble and judgmental silence, the Everleigh Club was warm silk and appreciative laughter. Where his marriage was a performance of respectability masking mutual indifference, the club offered the simulation of intimacy without the burden of genuine emotion. Where his role at the store required him to pretend competence he did not possess, the club allowed him to be valued simply for the currency he carried, rather than the dynasty he represented. But the underworld, however gilded, was fundamentally predatory. The very exclusivity that drew Marshall in also insulated him from reality, allowing his double life to metastasize beyond his control. He began to spend more time at the club than in his own home, arriving in the late evenings when respectable Prairie Avenue locked its doors and remaining until dawn painted the sky above the levee. The butterflies became his confidantess, the Everleigh sisters his de facto therapists. He was drinking heavily now, the champagne and aged whiskey flowing freely, in a place where no one would dare cut off a field. The alcohol numbed the neurasthenia, quieting the anxious buzzing in his mind, but it also eroded whatever remained of his judgment. The gambling began innocuously, as these distractions always do. Cards appeared wherever bored, wealthy men gathered after midnight. Dice clinked against mahogany tables. Credit flowed as freely as the champagne, and settling accounts was often postponed to some distant, nebulous future. For a man like Marshall, already numb to the value of money and desperate for any sensation that could cut through the fog of his medicated despair, gambling provided a dangerous thrill. The stakes escalated with frightening speed. Rumors began to circulate through the levee's whispered networks that the Field heir was accumulating staggering debts, sums whispered to exceed $100,000, a fortune that even his substantial allowance could not easily absorb without attracting his father's scrutiny. He was swimming in waters filled with sharks, professional gamblers, blackmailers, and men who recognized a soft target in the melancholy Heir. The immunity he felt inside the club was an illusion. The violence of the levee was always waiting just outside the velvet curtains, like wolves pacing the perimeter of a campfire. Arguments erupted over perceived slights, over women, over gambling debts that were not being honored with sufficient speed. Voices were raised in rooms that were contractually obligated to remain hushed. There were whispered threats, subtle reminders that even the most powerful surname in Chicago offered no protection against a man who felt cheated at a card table or dishonored by a broken promise. By the autumn of 1905, Marshall's carefully constructed double life was not merely fraying, but actively disintegrating. His absences from the Prairie Avenue mansion grew longer and less explicable. He would disappear for entire evenings, offering no explanation to Albertine, who had long since stopped asking uncomfortable questions. His behavior at the club became more erratic, his drinking heavier, his mood swinging from melancholic silence to aggressive confrontation. The neurasthenia that had plagued him for years was evolving into something more volatile, a desperation that made him unpredictable and dangerous. Most alarmingly, he began to arm himself. He purchased a nickel-plated .38 caliber revolver, a compact and lethal weapon that had no place in the life of a retail executive. The official explanation, crafted for anyone who might ask, was that he enjoyed target shooting, a gentleman's hobby that required no further elaboration. But gentlemen who shoot clay pigeons at country clubs do not carry loaded handguns into brothels at 3 a.m. Men who hunt pheasants on organized weekend expeditions do not need to conceal weapons beneath their dinner jackets while drinking champagne in perfumed parlors. The gun was a physical manifestation of his paranoia, a cold steel acknowledgement that the sanctuary of the Everleigh Club had been breached by something or someone he feared. The weapon became a constant weight in his pocket, a reminder that the game he was playing had stakes far higher than the $50 required for admission. The Everleigh sisters, ever pragmatic, watched their most famous client with growing unease, calculating the risk he posed to their establishment against the fortune he spent there nightly. They saw the trembling hands, the erratic moods, the way he would stare into the middle distance as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Marshall Field II was a man standing on a precipice, staring down into the abyss of his own making. The snow had begun to fall over Chicago as November deepened, covering the city in deceptive white silence. But inside the Everleigh Club, the music played on, the champagne flowed, and the heir to America's greatest retail empire moved closer to the moment when the two halves of his life would collide with catastrophic force. He walked through those heavy oak doors night after night, seeking salvation in the arms of the underworld, unaware that he was walking directly into the crosshairs of fate. He believed his fortune could insulate him from the Levi's violence, forgetting that gold shines equally bright on a crown or a coffin. The bullet entered 2 inches below Marshall Field II's navel, angled sharply upward and tore through more than flesh. It shredded the carefully constructed myth of an entire dynasty. To understand the catastrophe that unfolded in the early hours of November 22, 1905, one must first dismantle the official narrative, constructed with such desperate efficiency that it became history before the blood had dried. The authorized version, appearing in every Chicago newspaper by noon, described a tragic domestic accident. Marshall Field II, suffering from nervous exhaustion, had been cleaning his sporting revolver in the privacy of his study when the weapon accidentally discharged. A regrettable mishap befalling a gentleman in his own home. But bullets tell stories that money cannot rewrite, and the trajectory of this particular bullet made the official account not merely implausible, but physically impossible. Let us reconstruct what the silence of power has attempted to bury forever. Room 7 of the Everleigh Club, approximately 3:30 in the morning, when Chicago's respectable citizens sleep soundly behind locked doors, and only the city's insomniacs, sinners, and police patrol the frozen streets. The air in the perfumed chamber is thick with the mingled scents of violets, tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of money that has changed hands throughout the long night. Gas lamps burn low, casting amber shadows across silk wallpaper and the pristine white expanse of bed linens that will shortly be ruined beyond salvage. Marshall Field II is present, his mental state deteriorated after hours of drinking and whatever other indulgences the evening has provided. The nickel-plated, .38 caliber revolver that has become his constant neurotic companion lies within reach, a talisman of control in a life where he feels none. His hands tremble, whether from alcohol, laudanum, or the perpetual anxiety that has plagued him for years. The circumstances leading to the gunshot remain disputed because everyone involved possessed overwhelming incentives for confusion. 3 scenarios emerge from the whispered testimonies and contradictory accounts that survived the systematic erasure. Was it an accident born of carelessness? The fumbling of a man whose coordination was compromised by champagne and exhaustion? Was it a deliberate act of despair, the final surrender of a soul crushed beneath 37 years of suffocating expectations? Or was it something darker? An argument with another patron over gambling debts or perceived insults, a confrontation that escalated beyond words when desperate men carried weapons. The question of whether Marshall was alone in that room haunts the mystery. Some accounts whisper of a woman present, one of the Everleigh butterflies who would vanish from Chicago with suspicious speed. Others suggest another male patron, a dispute over cards that turned violent. Still others maintain he was solitary, wrestling with demons that had pursued him from his father's marble fortress. The gun fires. The report shatters the perfumed stillness like a thunderclap, a single violent punctuation in a house built on whispered endearments and the gentle clink of crystal. For an eternal instant, there is only shock. Then the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder rises, cutting through the sweet atmosphere that has until now ruled the sanctuary. The pain arrives with catastrophic immediacy. The bullet tears through his white dress shirt, through skin and muscle, entering low on the abdomen and traveling upward at an angle that will become the most damning piece of physical evidence against the official narrative. This trajectory is wrong for a man cleaning a firearm at waist height. It suggests either deliberate self-destruction or a struggle, the weapon angled upward as hands fought for control. Marshall collapses, his elegant form crumpling onto Persian carpets that cost more than most Chicago workers earned in 5 years. Blood spreads across the immaculate silk of his shirt with terrifying speed, the dark stain blooming like some obscene flower against the white fabric. His hands clutch instinctively at the wound, attempting with childlike futility to hold himself together, while his breath tears from his throat in ragged gasps. The Everleigh sisters materialize in the doorway within moments, their faces composed masks that reveal nothing of the calculations already occurring behind their eyes. Minna and Ada had built their empire on managing the impossible situations that arose when powerful men behaved badly in their establishment. But this transcended their considerable expertise in crisis management. This was not a drunken altercation that could be smoothed over with apologies and compensation. This was Marshall Field II bleeding out on their carpet, and if the truth emerged, it would destroy not merely the Field family, but the entire ecosystem of corruption that allowed the Levy to exist. They understand immediately that this catastrophe cannot be solved with routine discretion. This is the heir to Chicago's greatest fortune dying in a brothel, and the implications are staggering. Aldermen would be forced to act. Police captains would be compelled to investigate. The club itself would be shuttered within days, their empire reduced to ruins. A physician is summoned at 3:45 a.m., roused from sleep with urgent but deliberately vague instructions. He arrives 30 minutes later, expecting perhaps a knife wound or an overdose, the routine emergencies of the district. Instead, he finds Marshall Field II, immediately recognizable despite the blood and shock, lying on silk sheets in a room that reeks of perfume, gunpowder, and desperation. The doctor examines the wound with professional efficiency while his mind races through the implications. This is not survivable with 1905 medicine. Marshall Field II is dying, and everyone in the room knows it. But the physician also recognizes the impossible angle of entry, the location that defies any explanation of accidental discharge during cleaning, the unmistakable atmosphere of the room where he found his patient. Marshall remains conscious, coherent, and crucially, cooperative with the narrative already crystallizing around him like protective armor. Perhaps he understands that his final service to the dynasty that suffocated him is to shield it from scandal. Perhaps he is simply too broken to resist the inevitable rewriting of his death. "It was an accident," he whispers through gritted teeth, each word costing visible effort. At home, cleaning the gun. The physician meets his eyes, sees the lie, understands its necessity. He nods, accepting the fiction, becoming complicit in the conspiracy forming with terrible speed. By 5 a.m., an extraordinary operation begins. Marshall is transported not to a hospital, where records would be kept and questions asked, but directly to the Field Mansion on Prairie Avenue. The journey is logistically complex and dangerous, moving a dying man through Chicago streets in pre-dawn darkness, avoiding police patrols, ensuring no witnesses who might compromise the emerging narrative. At the mansion, prepared with frantic efficiency, the family physician takes over. Servants are awakened and briefed, given their roles in the fiction. The private study is staged as the accident site, a chair positioned near the gun cabinet, cleaning supplies arranged with theatrical precision, the revolver placed where it might plausibly have been handled. The story crystallizes with the same ruthless efficiency that built the Field commercial empire, a tragic domestic accident while cleaning a firearm in his private study. No police investigation is requested. No coroner's inquiry is demanded. Marshall Field moves with absolute authority, ensuring that every element of Chicago's power structure understands its role in maintaining the official narrative. Marshall Field II dies at 3:00 p.m. On November 22nd, surrounded by family members who had spent the morning perfecting the circumstances of his official death, the death certificate lists accidental gunshot wound sustained at the family residence. No mention of the Everleigh Club, no reference to the actual location, no acknowledgement of the hours between the shooting and the discovery. The lie becomes official record, and official record becomes history. Within hours, Chicago's most powerful family had erased the truth. But 3 witnesses to Room 7 would carry the real story to their graves. 2 bought, 1 buried. In the Gilded Age, the only currency more powerful than gold was the silence it could purchase. Marshall Field I moved with the ruthless efficiency that had built his commercial empire, deploying the same strategic precision he had used to dominate Chicago's retail landscape toward the far more delicate task of rewriting his son's death. Within minutes of Marshall II's final breath at 3:00 p.m. On November 22nd, the machinery of suppression was grinding into motion with industrial efficiency. Telephone calls radiated outward from the Prairie Avenue mansion like spokes from a wheel, reaching newspaper editors, aldermen, police captains, and every other node in Chicago's vast network of purchasable influence. The message was identical and unambiguous. The official narrative would be tragic domestic accident, and any deviation from this script would be considered an act of war against the most powerful commercial dynasty in the Midwest. By noon, every significant Chicago newspaper had printed accounts so uniform they might have been typeset from the same master page. The Tribune, the Herald, the Inter-Ocean, the Daily News, all carried variations of the same sanitized story on their front pages. Marshall Field II, suffering from nervous exhaustion and melancholy, had been cleaning his sporting revolver in the privacy of his study when the weapon accidentally discharged. A regrettable tragedy befalling a respected member of Chicago society in his own home. The coverage was respectful, sympathetic, and utterly fabricated. This coordination was not coincidental, but calculated. Marshall Field I controlled more advertising revenue than any individual or institution in Chicago. His store purchased full-page spreads in every major publication, seasonal campaigns that represented the difference between profitability and bankruptcy for newspapers operating on razor-thin margins. The annual advertising budget from Marshall Field & Company exceeded the total revenue of smaller publications. No editor with functional survival instincts would dare question the official narrative when doing so meant financial annihilation. The few journalists who possessed both curiosity and courage found their inquiries blocked at every level, their sources suddenly unavailable, their editors inexplicably reassigning them to cover municipal water policy or agricultural reports from downstate Illinois. Money began to flow to strategic recipients with the precision of a military campaign. The coroner, a political appointee whose modest salary left him vulnerable to supplemental opportunities, ruled accidental death without conducting a meaningful investigation or public inquest. His examination of the body was cursory, his questions perfunctory, his conclusions predetermined. The death certificate he signed bore no resemblance to the physical evidence, the impossible upward trajectory of the bullet, the location of the wound, the absence of gunpowder residue on the hands. But death certificates were merely bureaucratic formalities, and bureaucrats understood which. Families deserved scrutiny, and which deserved deference. The Everleigh sisters received their reckoning within 24 hours of the shooting. Representatives of the Field interests appeared at their establishment with the composed gravity of undertakers, conducting their business in the club's opulent receiving parlor beneath crystal chandeliers that had witnessed the previous night's catastrophe. The conversation was brief and businesslike. Substantial payments were delivered in cash, sums rumored to exceed $50,000, equivalent to nearly $2 million in contemporary currency. The money came with explicit warnings about the consequences of indiscretion. Minna and Ada, pragmatic businesswomen who had navigated far more treacherous waters, accepted the terms without negotiation. They understood the transaction perfectly. Their empire would continue to operate, unmolested by police raids or political persecution, in exchange for their eternal silence regarding the events of November 22nd. Room 7 was scrubbed clean within hours. The blood-stained Persian carpets were burned in industrial furnaces. The silk wallpaper was stripped and replaced. The crystal decanters that had caught the gaslight during Marshall's final moments were smashed and buried. Within 48 hours, no physical evidence remained that the field heir had ever crossed the threshold of Chicago's most notorious pleasure palace. Police records, if they ever existed regarding a shooting at 2131 South Dearborn Street, vanished into the bureaucratic void that consumed inconvenient documentation. Officers who patrolled the levee that night developed sudden amnesia regarding any unusual activity. The detective division, which theoretically investigated violent deaths regardless of the victim's social standing, discovered that this particular case required no investigation whatsoever. The entire apparatus of law enforcement became an extension of the Field family's privacy, protecting the dynasty from the consequences of its heir's final, desperate gamble. The funeral became a spectacular performance of Victorian grief, a public pageant designed to reinforce the legitimacy of the official story. On November 25th, 3 days after his death, Marshall Field II's casket was transported from the Prairie Avenue mansion to the First Presbyterian Church on Michigan Avenue. Thousands of Chicagoans lined the streets, drawn by morbid curiosity and genuine sympathy for what they believed was a family struck by tragic accident. The procession moved with solemn grandeur through Chicago's commercial heart. Black horses pulling the glass-sided hearse, elaborate floral arrangements covering the mahogany casket, the Field family following enclosed carriages, their faces hidden behind heavy black veils that concealed more than grief. Marshall Field and Company closed for the entire day, an unprecedented gesture that cost approximately $50,000 in lost revenue, equivalent to nearly $2 million today. Every window was draped in black crepe. The famous clock stopped at 3 p.m., the official hour of death. Employees lined State Street in mourning dress, a silent army of clerks and salespeople standing vigil for the heir who would never inherit. The display was worth every penny, a calculated demonstration that the Field family grieved publicly and respectably, that there was nothing shameful or suspicious about this tragedy. Yet beneath the official mourning, whispers proliferated like contagion through Chicago's stratified society. In the drawing rooms of Prairie Avenue, where society matrons gathered for afternoon tea, speculation swirled behind delicate china cups and lace fans. The servants' networks, which connected every wealthy household in Chicago through an invisible web of gossip, carried alternative narratives that contradicted the official story in crucial details. Coachmen talked to other coachmen about strange midnight journeys. Maids whispered to other maids about blood-stained clothing that appeared and disappeared. Footmen shared knowing glances about the peculiar timing of their employer's accident. The whispers never coalesced into open accusation. No newspaper dared print speculation. No society figure risked social exile by publicly questioning the narrative. But in private, among those who understood how power actually operated in Chicago, everyone knew that Marshall Field II had not died cleaning a gun in his study. The official story was accepted not because it was believed, but because believing it was the price of continued membership in Chicago's elite circles. Down in the Levee District, however, there were no polite fictions. The truth was known and accepted as neighborhood fact. Bartenders, gamblers, and streetwalkers alike repeated the same story. Marshall Field II had been shot at the Everleigh Club and carried out half dead before dawn. The underworld knew precisely what had happened, because it had witnessed the frantic pre-dawn transportation of a dying man, the hasty cleanup, the sudden influx of money that bought silence. But the levee had no voice in the respectable discourse of Chicago. Its testimony, however accurate, meant nothing in the marble corridors where decisions were made and history was written. The burden of maintaining this colossal deception fell heaviest on the patriarch himself. Marshall Field I, who had weathered the Great Fire, economic panics, labor strikes, and relentless competition with iron constitution, began to visibly crumble under the weight of his son's shameful secret. The man who had seemed indestructible, whose legendary will had bent Chicago to his commercial vision, suddenly appeared diminished. His shoulders, always held with military rigidity, began to curve inward. His face, captured in photographs from the funeral, showed a devastation that transcended ordinary grief. This was not merely the loss of a son, but the collapse of a carefully constructed legacy, the recognition that all his wealth and power had been insufficient to save his heir from himself. 3 months later, on January 16, 1906, Marshall Field I died at the age of 70. The official cause was pneumonia, contracted, according to family accounts, after playing golf in harsh winter weather with his nephew. But physicians who attended him in his final days spoke privately of a man who had lost the will to fight, whose legendary constitution had been undermined not by disease, but by the psychological burden of protecting his dynasty's reputation. The merchant prince who had conquered Chicago's commercial landscape, who had rebuilt his empire from the ashes of the Great Fire, could not survive the knowledge that his legacy's continuation required the perpetual maintenance of an elaborate lie. The vast fortune, estimated at $120 million, equivalent to nearly $4 billion in contemporary currency, passed to Marshall Field III, the grandson, who was only 12 years old when he inherited not just unimaginable wealth, but the suffocating weight of a family secret that would never be officially acknowledged. Young Marshall III would grow up in the shadow of 2 deaths, the grandfather whose impossible standards had crushed his father, and the father whose scandalous end could never be publicly mourned for what it truly was. He would spend his life attempting to rehabilitate the Field name through philanthropy and civic leadership, as if enough good works could somehow balance the ledger of family tragedy. The Everleigh Club continued to operate for another 6 years, its discretion proven, and its value to Chicago's elite reaffirmed by the successful suppression of the Field scandal. Minna and Ada understood that they had passed a crucial test, demonstrating that even the most catastrophic incident could be managed if sufficient money and mutual interest aligned. Their empire would eventually fall not to scandal but to progressive reform movements that finally succeeded in shutting down the Levee District in 1911, but by then, the sisters had accumulated fortunes that allowed them to retire in comfort and absolute silence. The official story hardened into accepted history with the inexorability of concrete setting. Subsequent biographies of Marshall Field I mentioned his son's death in passing, always describing it as a tragic accident at home. The Everleigh Club's role was scrubbed from respectable historical accounts, relegated to the realm of unverifiable rumor and scandalous speculation. Generations of Chicagoans would walk past the site where the dynasty's heir had actually died, utterly unaware of the blood that had soaked into those Persian carpets on a November morning in 1905. The physical evidence, the blood-stained sheets, the torn shirt, the bullet itself, disappeared into the incinerators of history, consumed by the same fires that had once destroyed and rebuilt Chicago itself. And so the lie became history, the scandal became whispered legend, and the truth became something Chicago's elite could afford to forget, until now. Marshall Field and Company survived another century. The truth did not. Today, the building that once stood as a cathedral to American commerce still dominates state in Washington, its 9 stories of marble and mahogany rising above Chicago's Loop, with architectural confidence that seems to mock the fragility of human ambition. The famous great clocks still tick with mechanical precision, their ornate bronze faces weighing over 7 tons, marking time for hurried commuters who no longer know the dynasty that installed them. The Tiffany mosaic dome still scatters prismatic light across what was once the 7th floor, its million pieces of iridescent glass creating the same ethereal atmosphere that made Victorian shoppers feel they had entered a secular temple. Yet the name above the entrance has changed forever. In 2006, exactly 100 years after Marshall Field I's death, the store was absorbed by Macy's in a corporate merger that would have destroyed the patriarch's iron constitution. The Field name, synonymous with Chicago commerce for over a century, was erased by the same forces of consolidation that Marshall Field I had once wielded so ruthlessly himself. The irony is savage and perfect. His empire endured, but his identity did not. The physical landscape of the tragedy has been systematically obliterated by Chicago's relentless appetite for reinvention. 3 miles south, where the Everleigh Club once reigned as the gilded sanctuary of Chicago's most powerful sinners, there is now only asphalt and chain-link fencing. The address, 2131-2133 South Dearborn Street, appears on no historical markers, bears no commemorative plaques. The building was demolished in 1933, and with it vanished the last physical evidence of Room 7, where Marshall Field II bled out on Persian carpets that cost more than most families earned in years. Tourists seeking Chicago's architectural heritage walk past this parking lot daily, utterly unaware they are traversing ground that once absorbed the blood of America's most scandalous secret. The Prairie Avenue mansion suffered an equally deliberate fate. That fortress of mahogany and melancholy, where the official fiction was hastily constructed in pre-dawn darkness, was demolished in the 1950s. The entire neighborhood, once Chicago's most exclusive address, fell victim to urban decay and the elite's flight to distant suburbs. The Pullman Mansion, the Armour Estate, all the gilded palaces of Millionaires' Row either crumbled or were razed, their ornate interiors scattered to museums like archaeological fragments of a vanished civilization. The very streets where Marshall walked in his prison of privilege have been repaved so many times that no trace remains of the cobblestones his carriage wheels once traversed. Even the institutional apparatus of the cover-up has crumbled with time's passage. The newspapers that printed identical headlines proclaiming tragic accident have largely ceased publication or been absorbed by competitors. The Chicago Inter-Ocean vanished in 1914. The Herald disappeared decades later. The physical evidence of the conspiracy, those front pages that proclaim domestic mishap in coordinated chorus, exists now only in climate-controlled archives, examined occasionally by historians who understand they are reading carefully constructed fiction rather than journalism. Yet despite this systematic erasure, the fundamental questions endure with the persistence of unquiet ghosts. Was Marshall Field II murdered by another patron in a dispute over the staggering gambling debts rumored to exceed $100,000? Did a drunken quarrel over perceived slights or jealousy escalate into fatal violence when desperate men carried loaded weapons into perfumed parlors? Did he turn the barrel upon himself in a moment of ultimate despair, the neurasthenia finally overwhelming whatever remained of his will to continue the exhausting performance of respectability? Or was it truly an accident, the fumbling of intoxicated hands with a revolver that had no legitimate purpose in a brothel at 3 a.m? We will never know with certainty. His family invested too much in ensuring we could not. The evidence was burned, the witnesses were bought, the records were destroyed, and the official narrative was enforced with such ruthless efficiency that it calcified into accepted history. The conspiracy succeeded so completely that even now, more than a century later, the truth remains elusive, obscured by layers of deliberate obfuscation and the simple passage of time that erodes all certainty. What we do know, with the clarity that only historical distance provides, is this: Marshall Field II spent his entire existence attempting to escape a destiny he never chose. He was born into wealth he did not earn, groomed from infancy for a role he despised, trapped in a marriage that suffocated whatever remained of his authentic self, and haunted perpetually by a father whose shadow he could neither escape nor equal. Every element of his life was predetermined by forces beyond his control: his education, his career, his wife, his children, even the performance of happiness he was required to maintain in public. The neurasthenia that plagued him was not merely a fashionable Victorian diagnosis, but a rational response to an irrational situation, a sensitive, artistic soul imprisoned in the armor of commercial dynasty, forced to pretend enthusiasm for profit margins when his heart belonged to poetry. The Gilded Age promised, with almost religious fervor, that sufficient wealth could purchase anything. Power for those without bloodlines, prestige for those without aristocratic names. Even immortality through architectural monuments and philanthropic foundations that would outlast mortal flesh. Marshall Field I embodied this promise perfectly, transforming his iron will into marble and mahogany, his commercial genius into an empire that employed thousands and defined Chicago's identity. He conquered markets, survived disasters, and bent an entire city to his vision of what American capitalism could achieve. But all his wealth could not purchase happiness for his son. It could not buy authenticity in a life constructed entirely of performance and expectation. It could not provide mental health to a man whose every gesture was scrutinized, whose every decision was measured against an impossible legacy. Most cruelly of all, it could not buy a death free from the very respectability that had made life unbearable. When Marshall Field II died in circumstances that threatened to expose the dynasty's carefully maintained facade of virtue, the fortune could only purchase an elaborate lie, a fiction so expensive it required the complicity of an entire city's power structure to maintain. Marshall Field I constructed an empire that endured for generations, surviving economic depressions, world wars, and dramatic shifts in consumer behavior. His business practices influenced retail strategy nationwide, and his name became synonymous with quality and reliability. He achieved the Gilded Age dream of legacy, building something that transcended his own mortality. Marshall Field II built nothing except a secret so expensive it required an entire city's complicity to maintain. His life produced no innovations, no institutions, no achievements that could be celebrated or remembered. His legacy was purely negative, a scandal that had to be suppressed, a death that had to be rewritten, a truth that had to be buried beneath layers of purchased silence. He exists in history primarily as a cautionary tale, the disappointing heir whose scandalous end threatened everything the dynasty represented. The final irony, savage and perfect, is that the lie proved more durable than the truth. The beautiful fiction constructed in those desperate hours after the shooting, the narrative of domestic accident, of respectable tragedy, survived because everyone with power had incentive to maintain it. The Field family needed it to protect their reputation. The newspapers needed it to preserve their advertising revenue. The Everleigh sisters needed it to continue their operations. The police and politicians needed it to maintain the profitable corruption that sustained their authority. The lie served everyone's interests except the interest of historical truth, which has no constituency and no budget for purchasing silence. In Graceland Cemetery, where modest headstones mark the Field family plot, tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the famous name, photographing the graves of Chicago's merchant royalty. They leave without knowing that the most interesting story is the one that was deliberately left untold. The granite offers no clues, no hint of Room 7, no acknowledgement of the blood that soaked into Persian silk on a November morning in 1905. Perhaps this is the real legacy of Marshall Field II, the demonstration that in America's Gilded Age, truth was merely another commodity that could be purchased by those with sufficient resources. His death proved that money could buy not just silence but alternative reality, that power could rewrite history in real time, that an entire city's institutions could be marshaled to protect a single family's reputation. The cover-up became a template, a demonstration of what was possible when wealth, influence, and desperation aligned with perfect, terrible efficiency. He was heir to the greatest store in America, yet in the end, Marshall Field II discovered that the only thing his fortune could truly purchase was a beautiful lie, one that would outlive him, outlive his children, and perhaps outlive us all.